He played with fire and passion, setting stages ablaze with his saxophone. Yet despite his enormous influence, most people today don't know his name. Today, we're remembering the saxophone firebrand the world forgot. Illinois Jacquet was born Jean-Baptiste Jacquet in Broussard, Louisiana in 1922. But he grew up in Houston, Texas, a city that would play a crucial role in shaping his musical identity and career. His family had musical connections. His father was a musician who understood the world of performance and entertainment. Growing up in Houston during the 1920s and 1930s meant being surrounded by rich musical traditions. The city had a thriving jazz and blues scene, with clubs and dance halls where live music was performed nightly. The cultural environment of Houston exposed young Illinois to multiple musical styles and traditions. His father recognized his son's musical potential early on and encouraged him to learn an instrument. By his early teenage years, Illinois had taken up the saxophone. The saxophone was an instrument that had captured the imagination of young musicians across America. It was relatively new in terms of its widespread use in jazz, and it represented something modern and exciting. Young musicians were drawn to its expressive capabilities and the way it could cut through an ensemble with its distinctive voice. Illinois took to the instrument naturally, showing promise and dedication to developing his skills. In Houston, Illinois had access to musicians and musical traditions that were rich and varied. He was exposed to the blues, to jazz, to Caribbean and Latin influences that flowed through Texas ports. He listened to recordings of established jazz musicians and studied their techniques. He also played with local musicians and bands, gaining practical experience performing in front of audiences. These early years in Houston were crucial in developing not just his technical skills, but his musical sensibility. He was learning to listen, to respond to other musicians, and to develop his own voice on the instrument. By the late 1930s, Illinois Jacquet was ready to move beyond local performances in Houston. He was a talented young musician with real technical ability and a distinctive musical personality. At 17 years old, he joined the Milt Larkins Orchestra, a significant opportunity for a young musician looking to break into the professional music world. Playing in an established orchestra meant working with experienced musicians, traveling to perform at different venues, and being part of a structured organization with serious professional standards. It was an apprenticeship in the professional music business. The experience with the Milt Larkins Orchestra gave Illinois exposure to different cities and different audiences. He was developing his skills as a bandsman and learning how to function as part of an ensemble. He was also making connections with other musicians and building his reputation within professional music circles. The early 1940s were formative years for his development as a musician. He was still quite young, but gaining real professional experience. Other musicians were beginning to notice his talent and his distinctive approach to the saxophone. A major turning point in Illinois Jacquet's career came when he joined the orchestra led by Jay McShann. McShann was a pianist and band leader who was leading one of the most important orchestras of the early 1940s. When Illinois joined McShann's group around 1942, he became part of something significant. McShann's orchestra was a breeding ground for jazz talent. Young musicians who played in McShann's orchestra went on to have major careers in jazz. The orchestra was known for its energy and innovation, for pushing boundaries and exploring new musical directions. Playing in Jay McShann's orchestra exposed Illinois to a more ambitious and experimental musical environment. The orchestra was recording and performing at major venues. It was a step up in terms of the level of musicianship and the scope of performances. Illinois was surrounded by talented musicians and was learning from them constantly. The experience and exposure he gained during these years was invaluable. He was performing in front of larger audiences and making recordings that were being heard beyond his immediate circle. His reputation in jazz circles was growing. By the early to mid-1940s, Illinois Jacquet was establishing himself as a distinctive voice in jazz. The swing era was in full force, and big bands were dominant in American popular music. Illinois' playing was characterized by energy, passion, and a willingness to take risks. He wasn't content to simply play the saxophone competently. He wanted to make a statement with his instrument. He wanted to stand out and be remembered. His approach was aggressive in the best sense of the word. He played with conviction and intensity. During the mid-1940s, Illinois Jacquet made a series of recordings that would prove significant in his career development. These recordings captured his playing at an exciting point in his evolution as a musician. He was demonstrating his technical mastery of the instrument, but also his emotional depth and his understanding of how to create compelling musical performances. The recordings showed that he was listening to what other musicians were doing and responding to developments in jazz. He was engaged with the music and constantly working to improve and evolve his craft. In 1945, Illinois Jacquet participated in a historic recording session that would prove to be one of the most significant moments of his career. He was recording with a group that included some of the finest musicians in jazz. The session took place in Los Angeles, California, which was emerging as one of the centers of the American recording industry. During this session, Illinois played a tenor saxophone solo that would become one of the most famous saxophone solos in jazz history. The solo was a display of technical brilliance, emotional intensity, and musical creativity. That 1945 recording captured Illinois at the height of his powers as a young musician. The solo demonstrated everything he had learned and everything he was capable of achieving. It was distinctive and memorable. Listeners recognized something special about his playing. The recording was released and began circulating among jazz musicians and fans. Illinois Jacquet's name began appearing in discussions about the most talented saxophonists in jazz. The 1945 recording became a landmark moment. It established him as a major force in jazz and marked him as an artist to watch. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years when Illinois Jacquet was establishing his reputation as one of the major tenor saxophonists in jazz. He was recording regularly, sometimes as a leader of his own groups and sometimes as a featured soloist with other bandleaders. Each recording session was an opportunity to display his talents and to continue developing his artistry. The consistency of his playing and his willingness to work with different musicians and in different musical contexts demonstrated his versatility and his professional dedication. During this period, Illinois was also performing live at clubs and concert venues across the United States. He was appearing at the most prestigious jazz clubs in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other major cities. Jazz clubs were central to the jazz world of this era. They were places where musicians performed nightly and where audiences could come to hear live performances by their favorite artists. Illinois was a draw. Audiences came to hear him play because they knew he would deliver an exciting and engaging performance. His reputation as a live performer was as strong as his reputation as a recording artist. The 1950s were a decade of continued development and evolution for Illinois Jacquet as an artist. Jazz itself was evolving during this period. New styles were emerging, including bebop, cool jazz, and hard bop. Different musicians were responding to these developments in different ways. Some musicians were embracing the new styles wholeheartedly. Others were continuing with earlier approaches. Illinois Jacquet was someone who could move between different musical contexts and styles while maintaining his distinctive voice. He was open to new musical developments, but never abandoned the fundamental approaches and sensibilities that had always defined his playing. During the 1950s, Illinois recorded extensively. He recorded as a leader of his own groups, which allowed him to shape the musical direction and showcase his vision for what his music could be. He also recorded as a sideman, playing alongside other leaders and musicians. His recordings from this period show an artist continuing to grow and develop. He was exploring different musical territory while maintaining the intensity and passion that had always characterized his work. The 1950s were also years when he was touring and performing extensively. He was constantly in demand, always working, always performing. Throughout his career, Illinois Jacquet worked with some of the most important musicians and bandleaders in jazz. These collaborations influenced his playing and exposed his music to different audiences. He worked with Count Basie, one of the most important bandleaders in jazz history. Working with Basie meant being part of one of the most prestigious organizations in jazz. It meant working with top-tier musicians every night. It meant performing in front of audiences that expected the highest level of musicianship. These experiences shaped Illinois as an artist and as a professional musician. He also worked with Norman Granz, who was one of the most influential impresarios in jazz during this era. Granz organized important jazz concerts and recording sessions that brought together the finest musicians in jazz. Working with Granz gave Illinois opportunities to perform and record with musicians at the absolute highest level of the art form. Granz recognized Illinois' talent and made sure he had opportunities to showcase his abilities. These relationships and collaborations were crucial in maintaining Illinois' visibility and relevance within the jazz world. One distinctive aspect of Illinois Jacquet's career was his ability to move between the jazz world and the rhythm and blues world. While many musicians specialized in one or the other, Illinois was comfortable and successful in both contexts. His aggressive, soulful playing style had appealed to both jazz audiences and rhythm and blues audiences. He recorded with rhythm and blues groups and appeared at rhythm and blues venues, which exposed his music to audiences beyond the traditional jazz club circuit. This ability to work across different musical genres and contexts gave him a broader platform than many of his contemporaries. His willingness to work in different musical contexts sometimes led to him being viewed as less pure by some jazz critics and purists. However, Illinois understood something important about music and about entertainment. He understood that there was no shame in playing music that audiences wanted to hear. He understood that the line between jazz and rhythm and blues was not as absolute as some people insisted. He was interested in making music that was engaging and that connected with audiences. This pragmatic approach to his career meant he had more work and more opportunities than musicians who were more rigid about musical boundaries. The 1960s and beyond saw Illinois Jacquet continuing to work and perform. Though he received less media attention and critical focus than he had in earlier decades. New styles of jazz were emerging, and the music business was changing. Rock and roll was becoming dominant in popular music. The world of jazz was fragmenting into different subgenres and approaches. The glamour and dominance that jazz had enjoyed in earlier decades was fading as popular music moved in different directions. Despite these changes, Illinois continued to perform and record. He never retired from music. He continued to be active as a working musician throughout his life. During the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s, Illinois Jacquet continued to perform at jazz festivals, jazz clubs, and concert venues. He worked with younger musicians and maintained his place in the jazz community. He recorded albums that showed he still had much to offer as a musician. He was respected by other musicians and recognized as an elder statesman of jazz. However, he was no longer at the center of popular attention. The recordings he made during these later decades did not achieve the kind of distribution or recognition that his earlier work had received. He was working within a diminished market, even though the quality of his musicianship remained high. Illinois Jacquet's legacy is preserved in his recordings, which span several decades and show the evolution of his artistry. His recordings from the 1940s and 1950s are the most frequently heard today, particularly the 1945 recording session that became so famous. These recordings capture him at his most dynamic and energetic. They show a musician at the height of his powers, playing with passion and conviction. They remain compelling listening today, decades after they were first recorded. The excitement and energy in these recordings has not diminished with time. His later recordings, from the 1960s onward, show a different Illinois Jacquet. He was older, more experienced, and had a deeper understanding of music. The urgency and fire of his youth had not completely dissipated, but it was tempered by experience and maturity. These later recordings are interesting for what they reveal about how musicians develop and change over time. They show someone who continued to grow as an artist, even as his circumstances changed and as popular musical tastes shifted away from his work. For listeners interested in Illinois Jacquet's complete artistic journey, these later recordings are essential. Several factors contributed to Illinois Jacquet's fading from public consciousness, despite his significant historical importance. First, the music business itself changed dramatically. Jazz, which had been a central element of American popular music, became increasingly marginal. The emergence of rock and roll in the 1950s and its continued dominance through subsequent decades meant that audiences were listening to different music. Jazz became a niche genre rather than a mainstream phenomenon. Musicians who had been major stars in the 1940s and 1950s found themselves working in a diminished marketplace. Second, the development of new styles of jazz meant that musicians associated with earlier styles sometimes seemed dated to new audiences. Illinois Jacquet was strongly associated with the swing era and early bebop. As free jazz, fusion, and other new approaches to jazz emerged, musicians like Illinois were sometimes seen as representatives of an earlier, superseded approach to the music. This is ironic because Illinois was always willing to adapt and evolve. But once labels are attached to musicians, they can be difficult to shed. Jazz history, like all history, is selective, and space is limited for everyone to be remembered and celebrated. Third, the recording industry itself changed. In the early decades of Illinois' career, recordings were a primary way that jazz musicians built their reputations and reached audiences. But as the recording industry consolidated and as certain artists received more promotion and marketing attention, other artists received less. Illinois Jacquet did not become a household name like some of his contemporaries. His recordings were not as widely circulated or promoted as those of some other musicians. This was partly about business decisions and marketing choices, rather than about the quality of his music. In any competitive marketplace, some artists receive more attention than others, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with artistic merit. Despite being largely forgotten by general audiences today, Illinois Jacquet's influence on subsequent generations of musicians has been significant. Jazz musicians who came after him listened to his recordings and were influenced by his approach. His 1945 recording session has been particularly important in jazz history. That solo has been studied by saxophone players interested in learning how to play with passion and conviction. His approach to the tenor saxophone, aggressive, soulful, capable of tenderness, but primarily known for its fiery intensity, influenced how other musicians approached the instrument. Illinois Jacquet also helped establish the tenor saxophone as a lead voice in jazz. Before jazz developed the way it did, the role of different instruments was not always clearly defined. Illinois was one of the musicians who helped establish the tenor saxophone as capable of being a featured solo instrument, a voice that could carry a melody and tell a musical story. This was an important contribution to jazz development, even if it's not always explicitly acknowledged. Young musicians interested in learning about the history of the tenor saxophone in jazz would benefit from listening to Illinois Jacquet's work, because his playing was foundational to how the instrument came to be understood and used. In recent years, there has been some rediscovery of Illinois Jacquet's work by jazz enthusiasts and historians. As people have had more access to recordings through digital technology and streaming services, it has become easier to explore the history of jazz and to listen to recordings by musicians from all eras. Illinois' 1945 recording has received renewed attention. Jazz historians have written about his significance. There have been compilations of his recordings released by record labels interested in jazz history. Young musicians and listeners interested in exploring jazz history have discovered his work and been impressed by it. This rediscovery has been modest compared to the mainstream recognition that some other jazz musicians have received. Illinois Jacquet will probably never become a household name. However, within jazz circles and among people seriously interested in jazz history, he is being remembered and his contributions are being recognized. The fact that he has been largely forgotten by general audiences does not diminish his historical importance or the quality of his musical work. His recordings remain as testimonies to his artistry and his influence. Illinois Jacquet dedicated his entire adult life to music. He performed for decades, recording hundreds of sessions and performing thousands of concerts. He worked with the most important musicians of his era and influenced musicians who came after him. He was a professional musician in the truest sense, someone who made his living through music and who took his craft seriously. He was respected by his peers and recognized as a significant voice in jazz history, even if general audiences did not know his name. His career represents something important about the history of American music and American culture. He represents the contribution of musicians who worked in the early and middle decades of the 20th century, creating music that was important and influential, but that has not been fully preserved in popular memory. There were thousands of musicians like Illinois Jacquet, musicians who were important in their time, who influenced other musicians, who created music that remains compelling and interesting today. but who are largely forgotten by contemporary audiences. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered. Their contributions deserve to be acknowledged and appreciated. Illinois Jacquet's story is a reminder that musical history is selective. Important artists can fade from public consciousness even as their influence continues to shape the music that comes after them. His 1945 recording remains one of the most significant saxophone performances in jazz history. His career spanned decades and influenced countless musicians. Yet most people today have never heard his name. He is a testament to the power of great musicianship, and also to the way that time and changing tastes can cause even important figures to be forgotten. If you've enjoyed learning about this remarkable musician and his significant but underappreciated place in jazz history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of musical legends and the artists who shaped our culture. Thank you for watching.